I know from our perspectives, Highway 50 begins in West Sacramento, and it stretches over 3,000 miles all the way to Ocean City, Maryland. Many of you have probably seen that on your way back and forth commuting. In Nevada, Highway 50 splits off from Interstate 80 in Fallon, Nevada, and I-80 continues on, sleek and fast along barren stretches. And Highway 50 portion crosses the center of the state. How many of you have traveled Highway 50 at all? Okay, a few of you have. You'll know, you'll recognize this when I describe it to those of you who haven't. It's classic basin and range terrain. Its geology speak for flat valleys interrupted by parallel mountain ranges, right? And literally, you drive across flatness, and then all of a sudden your car starts to travel up. Sometimes there's switchbacks, sometimes you're going straight up, and you crest at the top of the range, the mountain range, and you look down, and there you see another flat valley and another mountain range that you've got to yet go over on your way to where you're going. If you imagine a geologic roller coaster, you've just described US Route 50. And it was named the loneliest road in America by Life magazine in 1986. Yet, it wasn't always so lonely. In fact, I suspect that it was first traveled by moccasined feet, and then by hobnailed boots of the 49ers who came to pluck gold out of the earth in California. And then the feet of men and women and children and horses and mules and oxen that had all their worldly possessions in wagons and the oxen were pulling them across the road. It was a route of the Pony Express for about 3 years before the first transcontinental telegraph was finished. And if you go there and you decide to sightsee, you can still see stones in a corral shape and the foundation of some inns that once watered human beings and horses both. It's a nation of migrants from the Midwest, from the Deep South, from the East Coast. People cross the Great Basin of Utah and Nevada looking for some kinder place to land. Immigrants from Europe and Asia and the Pacific Islands have crossed oceans to come to California and to Oregon and to Washington to pluck gold from the citrus trees. And some have crossed deserts and passed through the beautiful but deadly Sierra Nevadas. Earlier this year, I joined a group that was hiking near a trail near Donner. And we know the story of what happened at Donner, but did you know that there is a steep ravine that I saw that they call Roller Pass? They call it Roller Pass because of the many wagons that rolled back down when the winches and the ropes broke. 12 oxen per team to haul a wagon that was winched up and up and up, trying to get through that pass. It was pretty scary just to even look down that pass, and it was hard to imagine people trying to come up. We are a nation of migrants. We are a nation of immigrants. We're sojourners from another land, unless we happen to be Native American people who were here first. And I'm sure that the words of Isaiah the prophet came to the minds of those travelers, don't you? Make straight in the desert a highway, every valley to be lifted up, and every mountain and hill to be made low, and uneven ground to be made level, and the uneven and the rough places to be plain. And yet, like travelers that came along Highway 50, most of us have had to travel mountains and valleys, haven't we? We've had to follow along a pathway in the desert. And they had to follow along a pathway where water and fuel for campfires could be found. That I-80 pathway would never have worked for those people. There's no places at that time for you to get enough water and fuel to live on. And don't we also pass through valleys and mountains in our own lives? When Isaiah first proclaimed these words, the people he spoke to were Israelites. They were in bondage. They had been carried away from their own homelands by the Babylonians. The Babylonians shrewdly carried away the leadership of the nation of Israel so that they couldn't mount any resistance. They went away from their homeland on the King's Highway. It was one of the few highways that was cared for, tended. It was secured by soldiers from ancient times, from Egypt all the way to Mesopotamia. The King's Highway ran through the Near East, right through the land of Israel. It was a level highway. It wasn't a level highway, sorry. It was hills and valleys and things, but I imagine that they wished it were a level highway so that they could find their way back home, so they could see their promised land once again that they had been stolen away from. In captivity, Isaiah spoke these words about wilderness and desert to remind the people who they were. You see, they had to recall their identity as people who had once been called out of Egypt. God had called Moses to lead the Israelites, the Hebrews at that time, to come up out of Egypt and find their promised land in the land of Canaan. And they wandered. They wandered for 40 years, according to the book of Exodus. They wandered, and they had to find food, and they had to find water along the way, and sometimes it was difficult. And they went from place to place, and whenever they were there, God came through, and we have the stories of manna that was delivered, and places where Moses would hit a rock and water would spring up out of outcrops. You see, Isaiah had to remind them who they were. And that was actually the time that most of the Bible that we call the Old Testament was actually first written down, is when people were away from their homelands and they were trying to remember it. And they wrote down the stories, the oral tradition at that time. And they also started to make rules, the laws about who they were and what laws they wanted to follow to be God's people in a strange place. And the stories were unique among the stories of gods and goddesses in the Near East because their God cared about the story of the sojourner, cared about the immigrant, and cared about the migrants. The traditions and the stories and the customs and the laws of the people of Israel were different than the rest of the people of the land. They had laws about caring for the widow and the orphan and the stranger. There were expectations for the dominant culture and for the immigrants to get along together, and the rules that they made a way for that to happen. It was God's way of making a way for the people to get along. And the 40 years, well, Rachel Helms describes that number 40 as being very symbolic in the Bible. We recall that the Bible has the 40 years of wandering, right? And we don't know why 40 years, but whenever there was a story of deliverance, there's almost always that number 40 in there. And Rachel talks about the similarity of 40 years in the desert and Jesus being 40 years or 40 days in the wilderness with no food and water. And we celebrate 40 days of Lent before Easter, don't we? And it's a time of using that symbolic number. Why? We don't know. But Rachel talks about the similarity of human development. It takes 40 weeks for a human being to be going from an egg to being an infant, right? And she talks about her own story of fearfulness and the pregnancy of her second pregnancy. You see, she lost her first child in a miscarriage, so she wasn't able to carry to full term. And so when she had a second pregnancy, she was up a roller coaster of emotions. At night, she couldn't sleep because of fear and anxiety about will she carry this one to full term. And during the day, her days were both mountains of expectation and joy and valleys of worry and doubt when she would have a twinge instead of a knee or an arm rolling across her on the inside. She describes this time, and she talked about how she made her way through faith, praying that she would just get through this 40-week journey, one day at a time, trusting that each day she was going to make it on that journey, until the very end, when her child was born, beautiful and whole and perfect in the 40th week. So in our lives as individuals and as our lives as a nation, we make our way through valleys and mountains, don't we? In 1963, another voice proclaimed the prophetic words of Isaiah to a nation that's famous for ideals of freedom and liberty and equality. He proclaimed them again because those ideals were not being made a reality for the grandchildren and the children and the great-grandchildren of people who had been slaves in the United States. Dr. Martin Luther King, a pastor and a prophet, spoke of the dream he had of a day when every valley shall be made exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. Level the playing field. Bring down the mountains of arrogance and privilege. Lift up those whose eyes have been downcast because their hopes have been deferred. Level the playing field in education and in the workplace and in corporate offices, so that God's crowning glory, the human being, who we were meant to be in the image of God, should be made fully alive, and each person should make their God-given potential. God's way must be prepared again and again and again. God calls the church to do this work in every time and age. Today, a voice calls out in the wilderness again. This voice speaks of the dangers of being alone in the desert, cold in the night underneath sagebrush, the danger of losing a foot or a hand as you're trying to jump on a railroad car that's traveling north from Central America through Mexico to the border of the United States. Parents are afraid that they're going to lose their child's life or their child's innocence to the gangs and the drug cartels and the sex traffickers, those who would exploit by others through starvation, through violence. The mothers and fathers of El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala are leaving behind their beloved homelands for the sake of their children. They have traveled together in caravans, much like the caravans of the immigrants who came over Highway 50 across Utah and Nevada and into California. Like those immigrants, they're looking for the message of that leading lady whose feet are in a harbor in New York City, who says, "Welcome, I welcome your oppressed and your poor. Come and find a welcome here." They're wondering if that leading lady will remember who she is. Will she welcome them? Perhaps it is a time for us who claim this Judeo-Christian heritage of the Bible to interpret these stories for our times too. We recall our stories of our immigrants coming and being here. Unfortunately, some of them being taken away from their beloved homelands and enslaved in this country. And some of us leaving poverty in Europe or Asia and coming here. We must not be indifferent to the story of the alien and the foreigner in our land today. There are no easy answers, but we are called to have dialogue and to remember the laws that are in the Bible about the care of immigrants and about the response of the dominant culture, Today and tomorrow, our bishop and other conference leaders are going to be gathering in Tijuana, Mexico, on the border of the United States, California, and Mexico. They're convening there to have conversations and to witness to that call of human dignity, that each person is made in the image of God. And they're also calling for due process, that we follow the laws of immigration that have been passed in our own country, that they need not be jettisoned and thrown out the window. Our United Methodist Committee on Relief is also working with the many churches and the communities and nonprofits who are trying to provide basic food and shelter and water to immigrants who are seeking asylum in our country. Yes, there are important conversations that need to happen. We need to find out what the rules need to be. We need to follow the rules, but we also need to honor human dignity and human rights. Let us hope that it will not take 40 years of wandering before our Congress will pass laws that are right and that are just. Let us not, whether it takes 40 weeks or 40 days, let the desert not be a dead end for hope. Let the wilderness not become a graveyard of broken bodies and broken dreams for people. God will be with us in this journey and in these conversations. And we must trust that every valley will be lifted up and every mountain of resistance will be made low. God will be preparing a way because we will be there, standing at the border and standing wherever there is injustice in the world. This is part of our lives as individuals, to ask God into our lives to take away the places that are rough in our own lives, to remove the obstacles to having our dreams fulfilled in our own personal lives and in our nation. And also those places where we have low spots, where we're not feeling the joy of the journey. We need to address that and find out what we need to do as individuals in our own lives and also as a nation to make joy and opportunity something that can be real for all people. God will help us to prepare the way. And I think it is a time to call our nation to prayer. It's a time to call ourselves as individuals to prayer. And so I'm going to ask you in this moment to just pray with me today. Let us bow our heads together and call upon you, O gracious God. Come and help to prepare a way for us through our individual valleys and our mountains that we meet in our daily lives, and also as citizens or hope to be citizens of this country. Help us find a way through the hard places in our nation, through those hard conversations. Help us lift each other up to discourse that honors each individual, that offers hope, that lifts up and does not tear down. We trust that you will be with us, preparing a new way for your people today. In Jesus' name, God with us, Emmanuel, we pray this prayer together. Amen. And now I'd like to have you join me in singing the last hymn today, the one that I intended to be here, which is Toda la Tierra, which is All the Earth is Waiting. I think that this is a song that is possibly sung in a Posada service, but it really speaks to the need for having justice in our lives today. Will you join with me in singing hymn number 210, Toda la Tierra, All the Earth is Waiting?